Okay, so I'm Steven, and I'm speaking about open banking and open source fintech. So I think it's actually really good that I actually followed Adam because I represent sort of the dual side to him. So I work for a fintech company which works with banks, and he works for a bank. So I'm going to give you kind of the fintech startup perspective on these things, and my talk is going to be about the shortcomings in the current banking infrastructure, how open banking and open source are a potential remedy to some of these solutions, and what's the best way to start interacting with fintech startups to maximize the wins that both institutions can have. So I'm Steven. I'm the CTO of a fintech startup here in London. I moved here to London about 3 years ago from the States. So my background is originally like Adam. I also came from physics before I turned to the dark side and went into finance. So my background is in a variety of things. I've worked in high tech, I've worked in banking, I've worked primarily on what I would call back office solutions for a variety of institutions in the States before I moved here to London. And I've seen a lot of back office, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I've also been heavily involved in the open source community for the better part of the last 10 years. So if you want to take a look at my GitHub profile and see all the projects I contribute to. My company heavily invests in open source. I think that's kind of rare for a lot of fintech startups. A lot of fintech startups tend to keep things pretty close to their chests, but the actual way to move everything forward as an industry is to start embracing open source as the standard. So that's kind of the crux of my talk, and it's something that has to happen from the fintech side and also has to happen from the banking side. So banking, it's one of the older professions. It's a profession that's been around for quite a while. So I have here the Bank of England. I think this is dated at 1733. We have a bank in 1795, and in some ways, some things have changed, but in some ways, a lot of things have not changed. Adam was exactly right when he said that the incentive structures that inform how management is formed inside these companies are often a bit behind the times sometimes, and that's reflected in some of the IT choices that are done these days. Most of the world, sadly, still runs on COBOL systems, even in 2020. I'm sure those of you who've worked in banking have seen all sorts of legacy mainframe systems that still run large market infrastructure across the world. And that's kind of a fact we have to deal with in this sector. It's slowly shifting, but it's taking a lot of effort to change. And a lot of things need to happen before we can start getting to a more progressive IT stack in banking. So my company in particular works with banks to help improve some of the infrastructure to help them better address the needs of their clients. So let me kind of put these things in kind of a broad kind of macroeconomic perspective. We have here on the left is we have like the banking institutions. These are very 19th century ways of thinking about the world. And then we have like the 21st century institutions. And they have a variety of, or a wide difference in the way they operate and how they do business. These old institutions, they just have a certain set of IT practices that are very old, very slow, very risk averse. And then you have these very, very progressive American fintech companies which iterate extremely fast. They get things to market faster than anything you can possibly imagine. They're eating the lunch of everything. Software is eating the world. And what I think these 19th century institutions have to do is they need to embrace some of the ideas that are common over in the high-tech sector and embrace those over here in the banking sector. So in particular, I would say the big problem from these in the banking sector is that reliance on external vendors to build solutions. If you've worked in the banking sector, you've seen these horrible solutions that are piles upon piles of Java code laid by piles and piles of bodies from consultants over and over and over again for 20 years. And that's kind of the norm. That can't work forever. People need to start building solutions in-house and building the technical expertise to kind of build these solutions in-house. We need to be faster in iteration. We need to be faster to market. We need to tighten the iteration loop between external parties. And we need to be involved with the open source community. So these kind of ideas that are kind of prevalent over in the high-tech sector need to start transferring over into the banking sector if the banking sector is going to survive. Because whenever I go out to the West Coast and talk with the American venture capitalists, the big story that everybody's talking about is how do we dismantle these institutions? How do we unfold the banks? Because a lot of these firms, they're getting banking licenses, they're going into financial services, they're going to come here and try to take as many markets as they can because they can't grow inside of advertising. And so that's kind of the big macroeconomic trend. So, banking, so I'm not here as a doom and gloom. I'm saying there's a way that we can move forward by adopting more open source practices that will help these institutions grow and become more adapt to the times. Okay, so the solution that my company particularly solves is we build in-house banking solutions for multinational corporates. So the problem that we see with most of our clients is that they have many, many divisions of their company. Each one of these divisions has one or more bank accounts, which they manage a specific amount of their working capital for doing day-to-day business, right? So they actually happen to have this massive proliferation of accounts that they have to manage internally, and this becomes a massive headache for them because they want to focus on their core competency of their business and not managing all of these payments and payable on behalf of and collectible on behalf of, but they're forced to do this in-house. So they're also forced to do this across the world that are multinational corporates. So everywhere you see this, there's some poor corporate treasurer, Janice, sitting there that has to manage all of these bank accounts for all of these different entities, for all of these different divisions of these companies, and this becomes a headache for them to manage. So we build a software solution that allows them to better manage these things. So intrinsic to this is banking integration. At the end of the day, we have to actually integrate with the banks and actually be able to issue payments, be able to collect payments, and be able to query metadata about transactions that are being sent through these corporate bank accounts. So this is where open banking and the standard that the European Parliament and the UK government have really pushed forward gives banks a chance to really, really, really innovate and do really, really progressive new products that can expand their client base, increase their deposits, and open up new lines of business. So it's a really, very interesting opportunity. So in practice, what happens with these IT projects is they look something like this. They have a bunch of RT architects. They sketch out some sort of system by which they're going to reconcile a bunch of databases inside of their organization. There's a bunch of databases. They have some sort of business process workflow that they model. And then at the end of the day comes a dashboard which some C-level executives can manage to see what their liquidity of their accounts is, manage their working capital better, to issue payments, or just get a better oversight of what their financial status actually is. So in practice, this whole thing is a very, this is how it's sketched out. In practice, these things don't actually turn out that well, actually. It usually looks more like this, where it's, instead of straight through processing, it tends to be straight to printer, where the actual databases are not actually done from database to database, but from database to paper to database, where a manual step is actually added to this. So I've seen this pattern over and over and over again in all of the projects I've worked on in back office. So in most of these organizations, there's a massive kind of what I call a shadow IT department, which by hook or by crook has to make these processes work by any means possible, not necessarily the best way possible. And so oftentimes you'll end up with these solutions where a proposed end-to-end system will actually be replaced with a bunch of very manual processes along the way just to make it work end-to-end to feed some sort of requirement. So Excel, for all its utility, has become kind of the universal corporate interchange format because it can be used to evade all sorts of compliance checks internally. It's quick to email an Excel document, and increasingly, I've seen Fortune 500 companies that run massive amount of their processes basically just on emailing Excel documents around. And that's kind of the de facto standard, but we need to move away from that because that doesn't scale as a way of doing business. So that's the problem that my company addresses. So if we look at the equivalent of what the high-tech companies do, there's a very different kind of way of approaching technology problems. And it's one that's based on a lot less zero-sum thinking about technology. So in the web space, for instance, you look at one of these web companies, they depend on a stack, just like the banking sector depends on a stack, that consists primarily of the composition of a bunch of open source frameworks, none of which is controlled by any one single vendor. So you look at the internet stack, for instance, you have TCP/IP at the lowest level, you have Linux operating system, you have web applications with a bunch of commonly agreed upon standards that everybody uses, and then you have a variety of web protocols that build on top of it. So these are organically grown, they're open standards, and they're collaborations that go across the entire sector. So Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Netflix, they all contribute to these web standards, and they all agree that this is the right way to do things. So this model does work. We see it working, but the banking sector needs to kind of adapt this kind of model, and open banking is kind of the right catalyst to sort of start doing this on a sector-wide basis. So the problem with corporate bank accounts It's a very simple thing at the end of the day. A bank account is it's a database ledger that records credits and debits. It hooks into payment infrastructure to receive wires, to issue wires. It has an audit log around who accessed the account at what point in time, who issued payments, and it has signatories attached with the account, which are legal requirements about who can issue payments and those things. But banking APIs simply just don't expose enough information to manage the processes around them. They require massive amounts of systems to basically manage all of the metadata about transactions out of band. So if you look at like a Swift transaction, the Swift transaction has a memo field inside of it, but it has less information than a tweet. So typically, you can send a wire for $1 million, and the metadata that you can attach to it is less than that of a tweet that I could send out on my phone. So when these institutions send money to each other, they're not able to encode the appropriate information that's relevant to the receiver of that transaction. And so they have to build these systems out of band to track where the payments are coming from. And I've seen large companies that have entire floors of people that basically just sit there and scan accounts to basically match, 2 million pounds showed up in this account, where did it come from? And this is a big problem for a lot of corporates, and they spend massive amounts of money basically just trying to reconcile these accounts because the banking layer just doesn't have enough bandwidth because it's based on legacy infrastructure. So our solution really looks like this. So it's a kind of a broad generalization of like what a lot of these kind of next generation fintech platforms are going to look like, especially in the corporate space. Is that we have a variety of fintech or physical accounts that are associated with some of the well-known British banks or other banks across the world. These are physical accounts that are opened up by the bank itself. And we have possibly virtual account structure on top of those, which manage specific subsets of the funds in those. And then we have a variety of business rules. We have a bunch of fund segregation rules and compliance rules that are layered on top of the payments that either restrict or allow certain payments to be done. And then at the end of this, we have a bunch of business actors that can collect on behalf of and pay on behalf of. We connect into a variety of ERP systems. We connect into payment APIs like wire transfers. And we have to do a bunch of reporting obligations. So the solution that my company builds is basically to replace all of this manual piles of Java that are typically done and replace it with a single end-to-end solution that uses open banking to talk with the physical APIs or physical bank accounts, and then uses API integration to talk with a variety of the external services that have to integrate inside the organization. So this is unique because the solution that we built has two big open source components to it. These are things that we as an organization have chosen to open source because they're not our core competency as a company. So open banking and the APIs that we do to a variety of our, to a variety of solutions that are typically used inside our organizations are things that other fintechs should be open sourcing because they're not part of the core competency of our business. And so this is a pattern that you should practice because it's one that basically allows a lot of organizations to open up more of the infrastructure and focus on the things that actually matter to their business. These are just example accounts, by the way. There's no affiliation with my company with either of these. It's just examples. So what we build is digital in-house banking solutions that allow multinational corporates to better layer these business rules and these transaction flows on top of their existing bank account infrastructure. So in particular, we can do 10 million transfers between 5 different multinational entities in 2 minutes versus the 1.5 months it takes to do manually. So that's a big win for a lot of these organizations. So open banking is a very European phenomenon. It's one that I think is going to be extremely important for the established financial service providers here to get on ahead of, because I think it's a once-in-a-generation kind of opportunity to catalyze a lot of change and open up a whole new lines of business for these banks. So you've seen primarily a lot of this push forward in the retail space, but I think there's a lot more business opportunities to be done on the corporate account side as well. So my company in particular, we don't touch any retail banking. We primarily just deal with corporate accounts. But open banking allows the potential for a lot of clients to better utilize the data that they're already giving to these banks and utilize it and query it in a way that's more structured and integrates better with their systems. So there's large opportunities for the banks to really just increase, just streamline integration with their key clients. which will lower costs, and to just increase the deposits of their clients. If they're able to build these kind of in-house solutions, they can open up a lot more accounts with the banks. They can use the accounts they have more efficiently, they can deposit more funds, and overall it just increases the bank usage. It doesn't detract from it. But there's a big kind of gap between where PSD2, as it was laid out by the government, and where it's actually implemented by the banks these days. And that delta is kind of yet to be filled and yet to be fulfilled by a lot of the developer teams inside of these organizations. So I think a lot of that is kind of what Adam mentioned, kind of a cultural difference between how typically risk-averse organizations have approached development in the past. And so I kind of wanted to lay out what I think from the fintech startup side were the kind of key points to think about and how to best approach the technical, cultural, and commercial sides of doing open banking. So I put together kind of a guideline about how to best approach internal development of open banking APIs. So this comes from my experience of reverse engineering a few of the European bank APIs, and what we saw was not good. Some of them are better than others, but a lot of them are very, very nascent. And if this is going to be a big thing, it's best to kind of follow a kind of set of best practices that a lot of web protocols have already gone through and not reinvent the wheel all the time. So these are the kind of things that I learned from working with large banking APIs in the past for 3 years. It's absolutely important to decrease the barrier to entry to these APIs. You have to make it easy to spin up developers on these APIs. If you can't actually allocate a bunch of my engineers to actually figure out your banking API in like 2 weeks, we're probably not going to integrate with your platform. We're probably not going to be able to do it because the barrier to entry is just too high. And oftentimes these things are, the APIs are pushed in one very small corner of the bank, and it's not given sufficient funding, and it's not really seen as it's seen as a cost center rather than as an investment. And so these things just don't get the light of day that they should. Don't put your documentation behind a login screen. So no big, if you look at Stripe's API, for instance, you go into Stripe GitHub page, you can get 15 different programming language SDKs. You can download them in 10 seconds. You immediately link to a HTML page which doesn't require you to log in. You can see all the API endpoints. That's a very progressive model that we should follow. Don't make me sign up for whatever developer login to basically just be able to access and query what your API is doing. Make it as seamless as possible. Don't make me also contact your customer services department or go through a client or go through a relationship officer or anything. Just put your documentation in the public. That's kind of key. Have a public GitHub repository which hosts your SDKs. You'd be shocked by about how many banks have these things hidden behind just massive walls of signups that you have to do to basically just get onboarded onto a sandbox environment. This can't possibly exist. American tech firms don't do this. Banks should not do this. This is not the future. You should be able to spin up a sandbox environment in a public cloud. Obviously, when you're dealing with banking APIs, you don't want to obviously give like a login credentials to anybody on the internet, but you probably want to be able to have a sandbox API that you can log in, simulate account transactions, see how the API works end to end, not on a live account, but on a simulated account. This is a very simple thing that most public APIs, web APIs do these days, but it's very rare to see in banking. So basically, instead of trying to spin up something inside of your internal infrastructure at your bank, pull out the company card, buy a $10 AWS instance, load your code up there, put a bunch of mocks, simulate it. Don't make me kind of log into everything just to get a sandbox to see if the APIs work. Using common encryption standards, don't roll your own. We have a wide variety of standards that are laid out by things like the NIST organization around how to do RSA, elliptic curve cryptography. Don't invent your own cryptography inside of your bank. You're not going to do it right. This I've seen, and it scares me quite a bit, actually. Avoid the cryptography hairball. So oftentimes the security layers of these things, I know how this happened, actually. There was a board meeting, and there were about 4 or 5 different models proposed about how to secure and authenticate users. And so the executive in charge of the product said, why don't we just do all 4 of them? And so you'll end up with this kind of multi-layered authentication mechanism by which I have to authenticate 4 or 5 times just to access an account. Don't do that. Make one authentication mechanism and pick one method of doing transport level security across this. Don't encrypt it and do TLS, or just pick one. Multi-layered cryptography is not making your platform more secure. Pick one for protocol level and one for transit. These days, XML is not the preferred interchange format anymore. Pick a public standard like JSON, if preferable. You can have XML as a fallback, but most developers these days don't want to be coughing up large XML hairballs. Don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, we know how to build public APIs. There's a wide variety of best practices about how to build RESTful APIs these days. Don't try to roll your own bespoke thing in-house. Expose status checks to your APIs. So I should be able to query whether the bank is actually able to service my request before I do my request. So oftentimes these things have to have a certain atomic nature to them when I'm dealing with real money. So I want to know before I issue, like, say, a $10 million wire, that the banking API is behaving as normal. Have a status dashboard to allow your partners to check on the uptime of the API. So downtime is actually quite common with these banking APIs. I've seen them go down for days on end. That's okay. I mean, this happens in APIs, but you need to be able to check on the status to make sure that it's not my system that's failing; it's something on the bank's. And then iterate quickly and version your APIs. So these things don't have to be kind of the golden standard of API that will kind of live forever inside the bank. You can version these things, have a V1, a V2, a V3, a V4, and then support maybe the last 2 of them. Don't think that you have to have this kind of forever and always API that will kind of live forever and service all clients. It's okay to iterate quickly and sort of break things and move forward. So there are kind of 3 big points I see that the banks need to embrace when doing these kind of open banking API transformation projects, is that you really need to embrace open source. The only way this is ever going to add value to the organization is if it becomes an open source effort. I need to be able to go to, pick your favorite high street bank and go to their GitHub page and download an SDK to actually build a product. If that's not possible, or there's too much red tape or too many barriers to entry, we're just not going to do it. We're going to go to your competitors. You need to set up corporate GitHub accounts. This is a very, very small thing, but just being able to ship your SDKs to developers in a way that they expect is really key. And it's not a very hard thing to do. You can sign up for a corporate account, have all the compliance checks in place on your code, restrict access, but it's a very simple thing just to disseminate the SDKs for your libraries. And then you should really see fintech startups as your beta testers for these products. Fintech startups have a vested interest in collaborating with large corporates for a variety of reasons. And you should see us as the beta tester because we're willing to put up with quite a bit to make our code work with your code. We're willing to spend months and months and months of investment just to make sure everything works end to end. So you shouldn't see us as the users, think of us as the beta testers because we're here to help you make your code better, and we're here to help build products that enable you to get more customers. So what Adam actually did, I thought was very, very appropriate as well, because there's a big difference in the open source culture versus what I would call the traditional enterprise software culture. So financial services really needs to kind of embrace what I would call the open source culture, something that I've been involved in for most of my life. And it's one that definitely thinks externally first. You should think how your code is going to work outside of the organization as well as inside. You should think internationally first. Code these days is not a phenomenon that is limited to one region. You should reject thinking this kind of zero-sum thinking that if we open up our code, it's going to somehow degrade the quality of our application or introduce competitive risk. Because in practice, making your platform more open is only the trend of most of these solutions these days. In practice, exposing SDK access is only going to let your customers do things they wanted to do anyways. And it's going to enable more clients and more fintech startups to build solutions that utilize your platform. And the most important thing about open source culture is that it's a community of people, and it's a very small people. It's kind of this Pareto distribution where about 90% of the work is done by about 10% of people. in the world. And if you look at the GitHub statistics, it follows this as well. There's a really, really dedicated group of people that are extremely prolific in open source. And if you can track people that are prolific open source developers, they're going to do amazing amounts of things in such an organization. But open source engineers want to work with other open source engineers. And the most important thing about the open source community is it transcends any one organization. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. Primarily, when you have employees that move on, they build networks with organizations and allow connectivity and bring in new business if they, because they bring the expertise about using your APIs to other organizations. And the more and more that these kind of standards and best practices becomes crystallized across an entire sector, the more we're able to improve the entire sector. That only happens when you have this kind of cross-pollination of employees moving between companies that are able to collaborate and build these kind of best practices. We saw that with the web, and we're going to see that with banking eventually. Maybe not this decade, but let's hope for the best. So what I would call the kind of key point about open fintech is that the key differentiator of your company is the trust of your clients and the user experience of your product, not the code that connects into it. And if your company doesn't embrace open source, your competitors will. So thank you. This is the contact information for my company. And